Hey all, this is Redditosker. Today, let's talk about Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, and why I think it could be perfect, why I think it could be the best Zelda game ever made. Its predecessor, Breath of the Wild, was an amazing game, but there was also a lot of ways in which it sucked, a lot of ways in which it was severely lacking. And that's not a surprise. Breath of the Wild represents a big departure for the Zelda series. For a Zelda game, it was treading an entirely new territory. And it worked out for Nintendo. What Breath of the Wild did well, it did very well. But it's obvious in retrospect that there's a lot of systems that were ignored or desperately needed to be fleshed out. Thankfully though, the kinds of things it was lacking are not fundamental to its design. The base of Breath of the Wild, its core, is a solid foundation. It's fertile ground for improvement. So for Tears of the Kingdom, the bones are already there, they're already made. They're going to reuse a lot of assets from Breath of the Wild. The art style is the same. The fundamentals of climbing, paragliding, and combat, I assume, will be the same. And what this means is that they're free to build on that foundation. They can modify and refine the things that were problems in the first one. And they can build new things. They can add more and more to what is already a very stable core. They can turn Tears of the Kingdom into the game that Breath of the Wild was not able to be. And personally, I am super excited to see that. I'm really looking forward to the next upcoming Nintendo Direct. I expect it will give us a lot more to look at. With it, we'll be able to understand better how Tears of the Kingdom differs from Breath of the Wild. But that's not here yet. So instead, let's talk about what the problems were in Breath of the Wild, and how Tears of the Kingdom might go about correcting them. First, just to get it out of the way, let's talk about weapon durability. That's the most common complaint I hear whenever I discuss Breath of the Wild. Everywhere you go, on any topic, even if it only in passing references Breath of the Wild, someone will make sure that you know that they don't like weapons breaking. Now, I tend to agree. I think it was implemented poorly. But before we really get into that, we should talk about what weapon durability is exactly, and why it was implemented. Breakable weapons are a consequence of Zelda transitioning into an open-world game. Maybe the biggest appeal of open-world games is the freedom and the sense of freedom. The ability to go and do what you want. The ability to see an interesting landmark in the distance, and then actually be able to get to that landmark and reap whatever rewards are there. So, for the developer, the question becomes, how do you reward the player for their exploration? If you're going to have this dazzling, beautiful, grand open world to explore, then you need to fill that world with things for the player to find. This is a problem that every open world with has to face, and they've all tried to solve the problem in different ways. Breath of the Wild's solution to this problem is to give all of your weapons a shelf life. If all weapons have a limited lifespan, then they are a resource, one that you'll have to constantly replenish. Now, this is an effective solution to the open world problem, but it comes at a few costs. One of the main complaints people have with their weapons breaking is that they have no sense of continuity to their character. They don't like getting a nice new weapon, only to almost never use it for fear of it breaking. They want to be able to get attached to the weapon that they're using. Finding a good or a good-looking weapon is an almost unpleasant experience, since they all come with an expiration date. And then at some point, a different kind of problem develops. Eventually, you get enough really good weapons that it becomes not worth it to engage in most combat. The joy of exploration is all well and good, but if you're exploring and you see a group of enemies, then you need to make a resource calculation in your head. Is the weapons that I'm going to get from those group of enemies better than the weapons that I already have currently? And very early on in the adventure, a lot of the times the answer to that question becomes no. Now, as for Tears of the Kingdom, I find it very unlikely that they're going to remove weapon durability. I think it's too important to the design. But I don't think it's necessary to remove it. I think it can be fixed really easily. There are two big problems. First, people don't want their favorite weapons to break. And second, you don't want people to forego getting into an encounter because they don't think they'll be sufficiently rewarded. Here's how you fix both problems at the same time. Make weapons repairable and upgradable. and make the primary way of getting those resources to upgrade and repair your weapons be enemies. So let's say you like this particular spear. It looks nice, or it does a lot of damage, whatever. And you'd like to keep using it for a longer period of time than the normal weapon breaking system allows. Well then, in that case, you can use resources that you get from monsters to repair it. And it should be repairable out in the field so that you don't have to return to any town to fix it. But then if you do go to a town, you can go there and upgrade your weapon. Increase how much attack it does, increase the durability of the weapon, at least up to a certain point. And then maybe even modify its attributes with rarer materials from stronger enemies. Breath of the Wild already has weapon modifiers. Things that let you throw your weapon farther, make your bow fire faster, or make your bow fire more shots at once. In exchange for these rare materials, Tears of the Kingdom should let you put those modifiers on your weapon yourself, and greatly increase the kind of modifiers that are available. Things like spear throwing does double the damage of throwing other weapons, or throwing your spear at the enemy doesn't break the spear, or throwing the spear will have it magically return to you after a bit. Something along the lines of what I'm talking about would really open up the possibilities. For example, maybe enemies have a tendency to use different types of weapons, and the resources dropped by those enemies can only be used to repair weapons of those type. So for example, bokoblins maybe only drop resources that can repair wooden weapons, which is the kind of weapons that they use the most. So if you intend to explore an area that's mostly infested with bokoblins, then maybe you want to upgrade your finest wooden weapons. That way you can keep them repaired using the materials you get from those bokoblins in the area that you're currently exploring in. Even better, maybe you can get armor that has set bonuses that increases damage with certain types of weapons, much like how the ancient armor does for guardian weapons specifically. An armor set that increases damage with bokoblin weapons, an armor set that increases damage with Goron weapons, with Zoro weapons, with Hyrule Knight weapons. And because you can upgrade and repair these weapons, using your favorites will become relevant for much longer. And because enemies drop these resources, and maybe even have a chance to drop the rare resources that you're out on the hunt for, the ones that will give you cool modifiers, then you can go into the encounter and just enjoy the combat. You don't have to make a calculation as to whether it's going to be worth it. I think for me, this completely fixes the weapon durability problem. Obviously, it doesn't have to be exactly how I described it for Tears of the Kingdom, but I think anything along those lines would work. Now let's move on to the combat. In the early stages of Breath of the Wild, I thought its difficulty was perfect. The combat is simple, and the stealth system is simple, but it is also unforgiving. For many of the early hours, you'll have no access to good armor, limited access to weapons, and you'll have yet to accumulate many food items. And even if you did have a lot of healing items, their utility at that point is limited, since your armor and health are so low that some encounters will one-shot you, or close to one-shot you. And you don't have access yet to Mipha's Grace or fairies to get you out of those predicaments. You don't even know they exist. In this early environment, attacking an enemy encampment is a joy. It requires a plan, and for the plan to go well. You can use your bow to silence the lookout, use stealth on your strongest weapon to remove the highest tier enemy, or the enemy carrying the most dangerous weapon, and then grab that weapon before the other enemies can use it against you. If you mess up, the stronger enemies will kill you in 1 or 2 swings, which means engaging in direct combat requires you to be proficient in the game's mechanics. Each of these systems is simple, with very little complexity, but almost every encounter had me using all of them, and that's all I ever want in my video games. I just want to have reasons to use the mechanics they present me with. Each of these encounters was difficult and rewarding. Each was hypnotizingly good. If you go back and look at the early reviews for Breath of the Wild, you'll find that almost all of them described what I'm talking about. They described the combat as difficult and unforgiving. And that's because they're reviewing Breath of the Wild as it exists in the early game, which I agree, it's the part in which I had the most fun. Sadly, this state of affairs doesn't last very long. As you start acquiring armor, food items, champion abilities, and weapons, dying becomes next to impossible. The food items heal a lot. In fact, you can make food that heals more than all of your health very easily, and you can carry more than you'll ever need. Meaning the only threats are enemies that can do so much damage that it catches you off guard and kills you. But in those cases you can have Mipha's Grace or fairies that will revive you. the difficulty that existed in the early game just disappears. Which means that the game that those early reviews were talking about, the difficulty that received so much praise by those outlets, doesn't exist 10 hours into the game. And for a game that people play hundreds of hours, I think that's a problem. Now, of course, it's normal and good for you to acquire resources and equipment that makes the game easier as you progress. You wouldn't want to be stuck, constantly struggling for your whole playthrough. But I also think the process of getting comfortable with the game should be more gradual than what Breath of the Wild provided, and that you shouldn't be almost unkillable unless you're really trying, unless you're really familiar with the game's mechanics and are trying to exploit them. It shouldn't be the experience for the casual player. So here's how I would improve the combat. I would limit how much food you can use in the middle of battle. You'd still be able to carry as much food as you had before, but in order to eat them in battle, you would need to equip them first. Like with weapons and bows and shields, you would start out with a very limited number of slots to equip food in, maybe 2 or 3. And just like weapons, you would use some resource to increase that number as the game progresses. Presumably Korok seeds or whatever Korok seed equivalent Tears of the Kingdom has. This by default also increases the difficulty and the gradual curve of overpoweredness, because now you'd have another thing to choose from when you're choosing what inventory to expand. I think this solves the limitless healing problem, but it's also good because it doesn't restrict your general food supply. It only restricts what you can eat in the middle of battle. But if you happen upon an encounter, and you're not in the middle of battle, and you want to eat something to increase your attack power or your stealth, then you're also still free to do that. But there's also other solutions that are maybe less restrictive. For example, they could implement something like, if you eat too much food in too short an amount of time, Link can get an overeating debuff, which would cause his stamina to drain faster for like 10 minutes after that. And then the duration and the intensity of the effect keep getting worse the more you do it. Again, it doesn't have to be exactly like this, but some kind of system that restricts how much food you can use, or causes the players to restrict it themselves, would go a long way to making the combat more enjoyable. Okay, we've got a few more things to talk about in terms of combat. This one's actually probably the most important one. We need way more enemy variety in Tears of the Kingdom. We can't do this thing again, where almost all combat consists of fighting the same 3 enemy groups. I like fighting Lizafos and Moblins as much as the next fella, but I've done plenty of that. And I'm willing to do a whole lot of more of the same thing for Tears of the Kingdom, provided that there's also a substantial number of new enemy types. This, I think, would be the easiest way to introduce variety to the combat. And of course they will. They have to. They don't have to put in all the work to make the Bokoblins and Moblins from scratch. They already have them. So it would be inexcusable if they didn't have a whole lot of new enemy variety. Especially when so many people complained about specifically that. Really, just variety across the board in all areas would be just perfect. For example, we could do with new weapon types. Maybe some shorter spears designed for throwing, perhaps. And of course, more Sheikah Slate abilities, or whatever the Sheikah Slate equivalent is going to be in Tears of the Kingdom. Finally, I have one more complaint, but this one might just be me. I don't like the Flurry Rush. Well, I mean, I like it as a concept. I like the idea of doing a perfect dodge, and be rewarded for pulling it off with a counterattack that does a lot of damage. That's fine. My problem is how it works currently. The window for pulling it off is too generous. It lets you do too much damage too safely, and I find how long it lasts a little off-putting. It's just long enough to get me out of the combat headspace. It feels almost like an interruption to what I'm doing. Now, I know that a lot of people are probably disagreeing with me right now. They probably like the Flurry Rush. But just hear me out for a second. Everyone that's played Breath of the Wild has dabbled in creatively getting through a combat encounter. There's a lot of ways to interact with the environment. So immediately rushing into a situation and just swinging your weapon until you win is usually the most resource-draining way of getting through a situation. So at least in principle, the game encourages you to use your tools and the environment around you. And because when you're first starting off your adventure, the game can be so difficult, and you don't have enough resources to mitigate all that difficulty, you're incentivized to engage with the creative ways you can approach combat, be it with your Sheikah abilities or with environmental hazards. You could use stealth to eliminate some of the enemies, or to grab any weapons they're not currently holding. If they're using wooden weapons, you could try setting them on fire and waiting until they disappear, because you really don't want to deal with that spiked Boko club if you have no armor. My point is, difficulty incentivizes the use of creative solutions to problems. But the Flurry Rush is so strong, so safe, and so easy to pull off, that it can quickly become your go-to solution to every problem. It can become an incentive to not engage with other elements of combat. That's pretty much my problem with it. But I don't want it removed. I think we can just nerf it slightly, make it a little harder to activate, and make it last less long. In fact, maybe instead of a series of blows, each weapon gets its cool own animation for closing the distance and delivering a single powerful attack. And I think that's pretty much it for combat. So that brings me to the last thing, the return of dungeons and dungeon bosses. Now, I think at this point, most people are pro-dungeon. Even if you started with Breath of the Wild and never played any of the older Zelda games, you're probably still pro-dungeon. Everybody is pro-dungeon. They're large, visually distinct, full of puzzles, so I'm just going to assume that the pro-dungeon propaganda has seeped into everyone's core. I'm not going to waste time trying to convince you of their virtues. I think many people are expecting them to return. The question then becomes, how are they going to work? Traditionally, the way dungeons worked is that partway through the dungeon you will find an item that lets you interact with puzzles that you couldn't interact until that point. You then use that item to get through the dungeon, and very often it's also the item you need to beat the boss. I liked that system, but that's not going to happen in Tears of the Kingdom. I think you're unlikely to see that formula in a 3D Zelda game for the next 10 years at least. In an interview, Eiji Aonuma has talked about how his eyes had been opened with the freedom that Breath of the Wild offered the player. He doesn't want your exploration or your progression gated because you don't have the appropriate item. So it's very unlikely that he would put items in the dungeons that you would need in different parts of the world. Even for something as simple as getting a Korok seed, I doubt he'd allow it. But that doesn't mean that the dungeons wouldn't be large or complex or filled with puzzles. One of the solutions to this might be expanding the roster of Sheikah Slate equivalent abilities, which would allow them to expand the kinds of puzzles that they can incorporate into these dungeons. As much as I often complain about the Divine Beasts, their puzzles really weren't that bad. I think they were just limited by how small the beasts are. They were limited because they had to exist in the overworld. But a dungeon can work the way shrines work, where you would need to enter a loading screen to get inside. This effectively separates it from the overworld map, and allows them to make the dungeon as sprawling and complex as they want it to be. I think that this is an acceptable compromise. Even if it doesn't have a unique tool, this way the dungeon can still be complex and high quality. I think this is probably the most likely way that they'll do it. But if they were going to add some kind of tool or power-up that you'd need to use to get through the dungeon, then I suppose they could give you something halfway through the dungeon that would only work on puzzles inside this dungeon, but would be of general utility out in the overworld. So for example, they could upgrade your bombs. In the overworld, this would functionally just make the bombs stronger, do more damage. But inside this dungeon, they could destroy certain objects that don't exist anywhere else. This way they can give you a permanent power-up that you keep, and introduce a tool that you need for this dungeon, and also not interfere with their philosophy of player freedom. I would also like for the dungeons to have music that's like the kind of music that dungeons have. I like the music in Breath of the Wild. I like the subtlety. I like the quiet moments. It works really well for the overworld, and in Breath of the Wild that's almost everywhere. But for the dungeons, I would like music that's closer in nature to what we had before. Something that really lets you get immersed in the dungeon atmosphere, and makes it clear that you're separated from the world outside. I actually think that the team has it in them, because I think the music for shrines works the same way. The shrines have a distinct atmosphere. They make it clear that it's a separate place to the world outside, and the music reflects that. It's very distinct, and closest to the dungeon music that we had in the past. Finally, no dungeon would be complete without the dungeon boss. The main bosses we had in Breath of the Wild were the worst. I don't really think there was anything wrong with them mechanically. I thought the fights were fine. but visually they're very indistinct and ugly. Dungeons should be unique and visually interesting, and so should their dungeon boss. He should be a reflection of the environment, and his design should make the encounter memorable. I think in general Breath of the Wild did a good job with the mechanics of their boss. In their second phase, they'll usually have some way for you to interact with them with your Sheikah Slate abilities. But they're also competent combat encounters. So I thought they were a nice mix of the two elements. So I'd be perfectly happy if Tears of the Kingdom brings that element of them to the new game. So long as they don't also make them awful looking. And that's really all I want. I want them distinct, visually interesting, and some kind of way to interact with them at some point in the fight with your Sheikah Slate abilities, or equivalent. Oh, and also, I just thought of this, but maybe don't make beating the bosses make the last boss easier. In Breath of the Wild, I would have really enjoyed fighting all the Blight Ganons back to back before getting to the actual Ganon. And so for me, clearing the bosses was a punishment, not a reward. Alright. The last thing I want is a traditionally told Zelda story, where events are happening to you in the present, and not you having to piece together what happened in the distant past. In my last video I mentioned how Breath of the Wild didn't have any sad or somber moments. And if any were present, they were all in the distant past, and you would know about them through the memory cutscenes. All of the emotional highs and lows have already happened. I liked the story told through those memory cutscenes, but I often wished that it was something that was happening to me. Something I could actually play through, not something I was just looking at. And I think that it's not unlikely. What we see in trailers of Tears of the Kingdom has me hopeful that a traditional story is what we're going to get. Okay, I think that's everything. I think the problems I've listed cover most people's grievances, and if they found some fix for those problems, almost everyone would be happy. I know that for me personally, if they fixed all the problems I mentioned, Tears of the Kingdom would skyrocket to being my favorite Zelda game. And then, on top of those fixes, if they add a bunch of new and interesting stuff that I don't expect and don't even know that I want yet, it could receive levels of adoration and praise that even Breath of the Wild didn't get. And that's the end of this video. We'll know what to expect in the upcoming Nintendo Direct. So until then, thank you very much for watching.